You will die in prison. 12-year-old boy sentenced to life for killing his mother. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The Jefferson County Courthouse stood like a stone monument to justice that morning. A justice that was about to render one of the most controversial verdicts in recent American history. The gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder, the air thick with tension and the murmurs of spectators who had lined up since dawn to witness the conclusion of what the press had dubbed the soulless boy trial. Daniel Ward sat at the defense table, his small frame nearly swallowed by the oversized chair. At 12 years old, he barely reached the height of the adults around him. His light brown hair was neatly combed, his blue button-down shirt pressed and proper. If you didn't know better, you might think he was there for a school function, not facing a murder charge for killing his own mother. Judge Carlton Reynolds adjusted his glasses as he prepared to read the verdict. The jury had deliberated for just 4 hours, remarkably quick for a case of this magnitude. In the matter of the state versus Daniel James Ward, on the count of murder in the first degree, the jury finds the defendant guilty. The word fell like a hammer, splitting the courtroom in two. "He's 12. A woman in the third row shot to her feet, her voice cracking with disbelief. From the opposite bench, a man stood up, pointing an accusatory finger. "He's a killer." The judge hammered his gavel 3 times, the sound cracking through the erupting chaos. "Order! I will have order in my court." As silence gradually returned to the courtroom, something happened that would haunt everyone present for years to come. Daniel smiled. It wasn't the nervous smile of a confused child, nor was it the triumphant grin of defiance. It was something else entirely. Calm, knowing, almost relieved. A chill ran through the gallery. "The defendant will rise for sentencing," Judge Reynolds commanded. Daniel stood, the chains around his ankles clinking softly. At his full height, he still looked like what he was, a child. His attorney placed a protective hand on his shoulder. "Daniel James Ward, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The gallery erupted again. Life. Prison for a 12-year-old. Some wept. Others nodded in grim satisfaction. Justice, they called it. For Julia Ward, the beloved teacher found stabbed to death in her bedroom. The evidence had seemed overwhelming. Daniel's fingerprints on the murder weapon, his blood-spattered clothing, his inexplicable calm when police arrived at the scene, and finally his confession. From the back of the courtroom, a woman with intelligent eyes watched the proceedings with growing concern. Helen Reese had covered dozens of murder trials for her documentary series, but something about this one felt wrong. Perhaps it was the psychological evaluation that diagnosed Daniel with sociopathic tendencies after just 2 brief sessions. Perhaps it was the speed with which the case had moved through the system. Or perhaps it was that smile, a smile that didn't match anything she'd seen in her years. Documenting the justice system. As the bailiffs led Daniel away, his eyes briefly met Helen's across the crowded room. In that fleeting moment, she saw something that the jury had missed. A question, a plea, a secret. I watched them lead that small, fragile-looking boy away in chains that day. Never imagining how deeply his story would soon consume my life. For most people in that courtroom, the case of Daniel Ward ended with the bang of Judge Reynolds' gavel. But for me, it was just beginning. The first step in uncovering a truth more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. My name is Helen Reese. For 15 years, I've made documentaries about the justice system, its triumphs and its failures. I've filmed inside maximum security prisons, interviewed serial killers, and helped exonerate 3 wrongfully convicted men. But nothing prepared me for the case of Daniel Ward. 3 weeks. After the verdict, I sat in my small production office reviewing news footage of the trial. The media narrative was clean and simple. A disturbed boy with no emotional capacity had murdered his mother in cold blood. They called him the soulless boy of Millfield. The perfect headline, succinct, shocking, and completely devoid of nuance. "We're really doing this?" My assistant director, Marcus, leaned against the door frame, coffee in hand. You know the network wanted that series on the Riverside Strangler. I paused the footage on Daniel's face as he heard his sentence. Look at him. Marcus, really look. On screen, 12-year-old Daniel stood motionless as the judge condemned him to spend his childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood behind bars. His face betrayed almost no emotion, save for that unsettling smile. I see a sociopath, Marcus said, just like the psychiatrist. Testified? I shook my head. I've interviewed diagnosed sociopaths. This is different. This looks like relief. Getting permission to interview Daniel wasn't easy. Juvenile cases are sealed, and access to minor defendants is heavily restricted. It took 3 weeks of calls, 2 rejected appeals, and finally, a reluctant agreement from Daniel's court-appointed guardian, who seemed eager to wash his hands of the case. Westridge Juvenile Detention Center looked more like a school than a prison, with its brick facade and neatly trimmed hedges. But the illusion shattered at the first security checkpoint, where I surrendered my phone and passed through a metal detector. The guards were polite but watchful. One of them, Officer Diaz, escorted me down a sterile hallway. Just so you know, he doesn't talk much, Diaz warned. Been here almost a month and I've barely heard him say 20 words. Has his father visited? I asked. Diaz shook his head. Not once, no other family either. Kid's alone in the world now. We reached a small room with a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 plastic chairs. A camera blinked in the corner. We'll be monitoring, Diaz said. Standard. Procedure with violent offenders. He's 12, I reminded him, and he stabbed his mother 17 times. Diaz's expression softened slightly. Look, I get it. It's hard to see them as dangerous when they're this young. But be careful. The quiet ones can surprise you. 5 minutes later, Daniel entered the room. He was smaller than he'd appeared in court, swimming in an oversized orange jumpsuit. His hair had grown longer, partially covering his eyes. Without the formal courtroom attire, he looked exactly what he was, a child, not a monster. Hello, Daniel, I'm Helen Reese, I kept my voice gentle. I make documentaries about the justice system. Do you know what a documentary is? He nodded slightly. Like on PBS or Netflix. That's right. I was surprised by his articulate response. I'd like to talk to you about what happened. Would that be okay? Daniel stared at the table for nearly a full minute before answering. They already decided what happened, before they even asked me. The simple statement hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't defiant or accusatory, just matter of fact, as if he were commenting on the weather. What do you mean, Daniel? He looked up. Then his blue eyes meeting mine directly for the first time. Everyone decided I was guilty because of how I act, because I didn't cry right, because I smiled when I was scared. My years of interviewing experience told me this wasn't a rehearsed response. It was too authentic, too self-aware for a child manipulating me. Would you tell me what really happened that night? I asked carefully. Daniel's eyes darted to the camera in the corner, then back to the table. His fingers began tapping a rhythmic pattern that seemed involuntary. The door closes at midnight, he whispered. So softly you almost missed it. What door, Daniel? But he wouldn't say another word for the rest of our meeting. As Officer Diaz led him away, I was left with more questions than answers, and the disturbing sense that a complex truth lay buried beneath the simple story of a soulless boy who killed his mother. What I didn't know then was that those 5 words, "The door closes at midnight," would lead me through a labyrinth of secrets, lies, and institutional failures that would change everything I thought I knew about the case of Daniel Ward. To understand a tragedy, you have to go back to the beginning. For the Ward family, that meant the small blue house on Oakwood Drive, a picture-perfect home in a picture-perfect neighborhood of Millfield. I parked across the street, staring at the house now wrapped in police tape. The front yard was immaculate, with neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds bordered by white stones. Julia Ward had been known for her garden. Now yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, an ugly intrusion on the suburban tranquility. She was the most dedicated teacher I've ever worked with, said Eleanor Winters, the principal at Millfield Elementary, where Julia had taught 4th grade for 11 years. We sat in her office surrounded by children's artwork and achievement certificates. The students adored her. Parents requested her class specifically. This whole thing, it's incomprehensible. I studied the staff photo on Eleanor's desk. Julia Ward stood in the center of the front row, her smile warm and professional. She was attractive in a conservative way, shoulder-length brown hair, modest dress, minimal makeup. What was Daniel like? As a student, I mean. Eleanor hesitated. Quiet, extremely intelligent. His test scores were off the charts, especially in mathematics, but he kept to himself. Any behavioral problems? Nothing serious, he was just different. Not in a bad way, she added quickly. He didn't socialize like the other children. Some teachers found him a bit unnerving, always watching, analyzing. But Julia was so proud of his intelligence. I asked the question that had been bothering me since I took the case. Where is Daniel's father in all this? Eleanor's expression darkened. Frank left when Daniel was 6. No warning, no forwarding address. Just disappeared one day while Julia was at work. It devastated her. And he never came back. Not even for the trial. No one's heard from him in years. Julia raised Daniel alone. My next stop was the Millfield Community Church, where Julia had been an active member. Pastor Michael Morrison received me in his office, a welcoming space with comfortable chairs and religious texts lining the bookshelves. Julia was the backbone of our congregation, he said, his voice heavy with grief. She led our children's ministry, organized our charity drives. After Frank left, the church became her extended family. How did she change after her husband left? Pastor Morrison looked surprised by the question. Change? People don't usually go through abandonment unchanged. He nodded slowly. She became more devoted, found strength in her faith. She threw herself into church activities, volunteered for everything. And Daniel? Julia was determined to raise him right, a God-fearing young man. She was strict, but only because she wanted the best for him. There was something in his tone that gave me pause. Define strict. The pastor shifted uncomfortably. Julia believed in traditional discipline, in our permissive modern culture that can sometimes look harsh to outsiders, but it was all done with love. I left the church with more questions than answers. My next interviews with neighbors painted a similar picture. Julia, the perfect mother, the dedicated teacher, the devout Christian. Daniel, the quiet, intelligent boy who never caused trouble. A model family, at least on the surface. As I drove through Millfield, I called an old contact at the county records office. Angela, I need everything you can find on the wards. Property records, tax filings, any civil disputes or complaints. The murder case? That poor woman, Angela said. I'll see what I can dig up, but you know juvenile records are sealed. I'm more interested in what happened before the murder. Any CPS reports, restraining orders, police call-outs to the address. 2 hours later, Angela called back. Nothing on Julia, clean as a whistle, but I found something interesting. There's a sealed juvenile record from 6 months before the murder. I can't access the contents, but it was filed and then quickly dismissed by Judge Reynolds, the same judge who presided over Daniel's murder trial. That's convenient, I said. There's something else, Angela added. Julia had a brother, Thomas Ward. He lived at the Oakwood Drive address on and off for the past few years, according to utility records. But he's not mentioned anywhere in the murder investigation. I thanked Angela and drove back to the Ward house. This time I focused on the neighbors. 3 doors down, I met Elaine Peterson, a retired nurse who had lived on Oakwood Drive for 20 years. Of course I remember Thomas, she said, inviting me onto her porch. Troubled soul. Had problems with drugs, I think. Julia would take him in whenever he was between jobs or fresh, out of rehab. When was the last time you saw him? Elaine thought for a moment. Maybe 2 weeks before Julia's death. They had an argument on the front lawn. Thomas was shouting about how she couldn't keep doing this to Daniel. Julia told him to leave and never come back. Did you tell the, police about this? They never asked, Elaine said simply. They had their killer. Why look further? As I left Elaine's porch, I noticed a man watching from across the street, middle-aged, well-dressed, observing me with undisguised interest. When our eyes met, he didn't look away. Instead, he nodded slightly as if acknowledging a mutual understanding, before walking purposefully toward his car. That night, reviewing my notes in the motel, I spread out photographs of the Ward family. In several of them, I noticed the edge of someone who had been partially cropped out, an arm, a shoulder, the side of a face, as if someone had deliberately tried to remove a person from the family history. The more I learned about the perfect Ward family, the more I became convinced that what happened in that blue house on Oakwood Drive was far more complex than anyone had bothered to discover. And, somewhere in this town, Thomas Ward held pieces of the puzzle that might change everything. The official timeline of Julia Ward's murder was established within 48 hours of the crime. According to police records, it unfolded like this. 9:27 p.m. Julia Ward puts Daniel to bed after evening prayers. According to Daniel's statement, 10:15 p.m. approximately, Julia is stabbed 17 times in her bedroom with a kitchen knife. Time of death estimated by the medical examiner. 11:02 p.m. Daniel calls 911. The recording is chillingly calm. My mom is hurt. There's blood. I think she's dead. 11:08 p.m. First responders arrive at the Ward residence. They find Daniel sitting at the kitchen table, blood on his clothes, the murder weapon in the sink. A straightforward case of matricide, or so it seemed. I obtained the police body cam footage through a Freedom of Information request. The video showed exactly what the report described. Officers entering the house, finding Daniel in the kitchen, his blue pajamas spattered with blood. His expression was blank, almost vacant. "Son, what happened here?" one officer asked. "I found her like that," Daniel replied, his voice flat. "Where is she?" "In her bedroom. Upstairs." The officer instructed his partner to stay with Daniel while he went upstairs. The camera followed him up the stairs, down the hallway, and into Julia Ward's bedroom. I'll spare you the details of what he found. Crime scene photos tell their own gruesome story. Julia Ward died violently, defensively. There were cuts on her hands and arms where she had tried to fend off her attacker. The bedroom was in disarray, suggesting a struggle. Blood spatter analysis indicated the attacker stood over her, continuing to stab even after she had fallen to the floor. Detective Ray Marshall was the lead investigator assigned to the case. I met him at a diner on the outskirts of town, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. "It was open and shut," Marshall said, stirring his coffee. "Kid's clothes and hands had the victim's blood. His prints were the only ones on the murder. Weapon. No signs of forced entry." And he confessed. "After 7 hours of interrogation," I pointed out. Marshall shrugged. 12 years old or not, he knew what he did. You should have seen him during questioning. Cool as ice. Most kids that age would be crying for their mommy, but Daniel, he was logical, calculating, answered every question like he'd rehearsed it. Or like he was in shock, I suggested. Marshall eyed me skeptically. "You're looking for a story that isn't there, Ms. Reese. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one." "What about the security footage?" I asked. "The neighbor's camera that showed no one else entered or left the house that night." "Exactly. Just proves our case. Except for the 17-minute gap during the estimated time of death." Marshall's expression hardened. "That system was old, analog, required tape changes every 4 hours, and there was a thunderstorm that night. Power fluctuations all over the neighborhood. It's a technical glitch, nothing more." "A very convenient technical glitch," I said. "Look, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know a guilty person when I see one. Even when that person is 12 years old?" Marshall leaned forward. "You think age makes someone incapable of violence? There was a case in Michigan. 10-year-old tortured and killed his neighbor's cat, then moved on to the neighbor. In Colorado, an 11-year-old poisoned her foster mother. Age doesn't equal innocence, Ms. Reese. And lack of emotion doesn't equal guilt," I countered. After leaving Detective Marshall, I visited the crime lab that had processed the evidence. The technician who had worked the Ward case had since transferred to another department, but his colleague, Dr. Vega, agreed to speak with me off the record. "Everything was rushed," she admitted. "Normal processing time for a complex crime scene is days, sometimes weeks. This was pushed through in 48 hours. Why the hurry?" Dr. Vega hesitated. There was pressure from above. The chief wanted it wrapped up quick. Child kills mother makes everyone nervous. Bad for the town's image, bad for property values. As she spoke, Dr. Vega pulled up the case files on her computer. There were some anomalies in the blood spatter analysis. See this pattern on the wall? It suggests the attacker was at least 5'8". Daniel was barely 5 feet tall. Was this included in the final report? No, it was deemed inconclusive by the supervising technician. I left the lab with a growing sense of unease. Every expert I spoke with confidently stated that Daniel killed his mother, yet small inconsistencies kept emerging, details that didn't quite fit the official narrative. That evening, I reviewed the surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera. For most of the recording, the Ward house sat peacefully, the only movement coming from tree branches swaying in the storm. Then, at exactly 10:08 p.m., the screen went black. When the footage resumed at 10:25 p.m., nothing appeared changed, except for the flashing lights of emergency vehicles arriving 35 minutes later. 17 crucial minutes, conveniently missing. Just enough time for someone to enter the house, commit murder, and disappear into the night. Or for a traumatized child to find his mother's body and make the most fateful decision of his young life. What happened in those missing 17 minutes? The answer, I was beginning to suspect, might rewrite the entire story of Daniel Ward. Few things are more disturbing than watching a child being interrogated for murder. I had reviewed hundreds of police interviews in my career, but the footage of Daniel Ward's questioning left me deeply unsettled. The interrogation room at Millfield Police Department was standard. A small table, 3 chairs, a one-way mirror, and a camera mounted in the corner. Daniel sat alone for 27 minutes before Detectives Marshall and Perez entered. No parent present, no advocate, no lawyer. "Do you understand why you're here, Daniel?" Detective Marshall began. Daniel nodded. His feet didn't reach the floor. "I need you to speak out loud for the recording." "Yes, sir. I'm here because my mom is dead. And do you know what happened to her?" "Someone stabbed her." Marshall exchanged glances with his partner. "Someone? Who do you think that someone was, Daniel?" "I don't know." For the next 3 hours, the detectives circled the same questions. What happened that night? Why was Daniel's clothing bloody? Why didn't he call 911 immediately? Throughout, Daniel maintained the same story. He'd found his mother already dead when he went to her room after hearing a noise. The detectives used techniques normally reserved for adult suspects: minimization. Maybe it was an accident, false evidence, we have proof it was you, and isolation, no one else is coming to help you. Still, Daniel's demeanor remained unnervingly calm, his answers consistent. Then came the breaking point. "Daniel," Marshall said, leaning close, "we know you did this. We have the evidence. Your fingerprints on the knife, your DNA under her fingernails where she fought back, the blood on your clothes. No one else was in that house." "I found her like that," Daniel insisted, though his voice had grown quieter. "I touched her to see if she was alive. I pulled the knife out because I thought it might help." "This would go easier if you just told the truth," Perez interjected. "The judge will know you cooperated. It could make a big difference." Daniel looked at the clock on the wall. They'd been questioning him for over 5 hours. No food, no breaks except for bathroom trips. His eyelids were drooping with exhaustion. "If I say yes, this ends quicker, doesn't it?" he asked suddenly. The detectives perked up. "Are you saying you did it, Daniel?" A long pause followed. Daniel stared at his hands. "Will I be able to sleep then? Just tell us the truth, and this can all be over," Marshall coaxed. "Then yes, I did it." "Why?" Another long pause. "She was going to lock me in again. I got angry." The detectives pressed for details. "How many times did you stab her? Where did you get the knife? What did you do afterward?" Daniel's answers became shorter, vaguer. After 7 more hours of questioning, much of it off camera, he signed a typed confession. I showed the footage to Dr. Amelia Foster, a forensic psychologist specializing in child trauma. "This is textbook coerced confession," she said. "Sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, no advocate present. And look at his body language. He's telling them what they want to hear so the ordeal will end. But why confess to something so terrible? I asked. Children, especially those from troubled homes, often don't understand the consequences of false confessions. They're focused on immediate relief, ending the questioning, getting some sleep, seeing a familiar face. She paused the video on Daniel's exhausted face. Plus, there's something else here. Look at how he keeps glancing at the door. He's afraid of something, or someone, beyond that interrogation room. I left Dr. Foster's office with a troubling question. If Daniel didn't kill his mother, why would he confess to a crime that would send him to prison for most of his life? What could possibly be more frightening than that? The answer, I suspected, lay in those 5 whispered words. The door closes at midnight. In high-profile cases involving children, the court typically proceeds with caution. Extensive psychological evaluations, careful consideration of home environment, exploration of alternative explanations. Daniel Ward received none of these considerations. Just 11 days after his mother's murder, Daniel was officially diagnosed with conduct disorder and sociopathic tendencies by Dr. Howard Phillips, a court-appointed psychiatrist who spent a total of 90 minutes with the boy across 2 sessions. It was a rush job, Marcus told me as we reviewed Dr. Phillips' report. Most evaluations take weeks, sometimes months, and the diagnosis conveniently supports the prosecution's narrative, I added. The report described Daniel as emotionally detached, manipulative, and lacking remorse, traits that matched perfectly with the prosecution's portrayal of a cold-blooded child killer. The media latched onto these terms, particularly the suggestion of sociopathic behavior. Headlines screamed about the boy without a soul and young predator in our midst. But something didn't add up. Dr. Phillips wasn't the first psychiatrist assigned to Daniel's case, I told Marcus, sliding another file across the desk. Dr. Eliza Montgomery evaluated him initially, but was replaced after her preliminary report. Why? That's what we need to find out. I tracked down Dr. Montgomery at a private practice in a neighboring city. She seemed unsurprised by my visit. I wondered when someone would come asking about that boy, she said, gesturing for me to take a seat in her office. What they did to him was unconscionable. Your preliminary evaluation suggested further testing was needed, I said. Why? She sighed heavily. Daniel exhibited signs of complex trauma, not antisocial personality traits. There's a world of difference. I recommended a full psychological workup, including tests for PTSD and assessment for possible abuse. Abuse? I echoed. You suspected Julia Ward abused her son? I couldn't say definitively, which is why I wanted more evaluation time. But Daniel showed classic signs of a child who's lived under constant threat, hypervigilance, emotional regulation issues hidden beneath a mask of calm, difficulty trusting adults. Why was your report ignored? Dr. Montgomery's expression hardened. 2 days after I submitted my preliminary findings, I was informed that my services were no longer required. Dr. Phillips took over. His approach tends to be more aligned with prosecutorial needs. Meaning? Meaning Dr. Phillips has testified for the district attorney's office in 14 cases over the past 5 years. He finds what they need him to find. Back at my hotel, I dug deeper into Dr. Phillips's background. His connections to the prosecutor's office were extensive. His wife worked as an administrator for the district attorney, and he'd received numerous county contracts for evaluations in criminal cases. More troubling was what I discovered about Daniel's court-appointed defender, Alan Richards. Phone records showed multiple calls between Richards and prosecutor William Hayes during the pretrial period. Highly unusual and potentially unethical communication between opposing counsel. They weren't opposing counsel at all, Marcus said when I showed him the records. This wasn't a defense, it was a choreographed conviction. I picked up a photo of Daniel from the evidence files, his school portrait from just 2 months before the murder. A solemn-faced boy with intelligent eyes looked back at me. Not a monster, not a sociopath, just a child caught in something beyond his control. While reviewing Julia's personal effects, which had been released from evidence, I came across a small leather-bound book tucked inside a Bible. It was a prayer journal, filled with Julia's neat handwriting. Most entries were conventional prayers and biblical reflections, but as I flipped through the pages, the tone gradually changed. Entries from the months before her death contained disturbing references to cleansing the congregation and concerns about E.S. spreading his corruption among the faithful. One passage chilled me. Daniel requires firmer guidance. The evil one tempts him through his weakness. Only through discipline will his soul be saved. The final entry, dated 3 days before her murder, read, "The door closes at midnight. It is God's will." The same phrase Daniel had whispered to me. As I stared at Julia's handwriting, I realized I wasn't just investigating a murder case. I was unraveling a complex web of secrets, religious fervor, and hidden relationships that had culminated in tragedy. And someone named E.S. was at the center of it all, the man who had been carefully removed from the Ward family. Photos had a name: Thomas Ward, Julia's younger brother. His absence from the official investigation was so complete it could only have been deliberate. "He's not mentioned once in the police reports," Marcus noted as we spread documents across my hotel room. "Not as a family member, not as a witness, not even as someone to notify about Julia's death. It's as if he never existed," I agreed. But according to utility records, he lived at the Ward residence on and off for almost 2 years. Finding Thomas proved challenging. He had no social media presence, no permanent address on record, no credit history after 2021. It was as if he'd vanished. But in small towns, memories linger. I returned to Oakwood Drive and methodically interviewed neighbors, showing Thomas's driver's license photo from county records. 4 houses down, I found Greta Simmons, a retired postal worker, with a remarkable memory. "Oh, Thomas," she said, recognition lighting her face. "Troubled soul, always coming and going. Julia would take him in whenever he hit rock bottom. When did you last see him?" "About 2 weeks before that terrible business with Julia. They had quite the row on the front lawn. Thomas shouting about how she couldn't keep using that room to break him." Greta leaned closer. "Break Daniel," he meant. "I always wondered what that was about." "Did the police interview you after Julia's death?" "Briefly. Asked if I'd seen anything unusual that night. When I mentioned Thomas had been staying there recently, the officer just wrote something down and never followed up. At the local convenience store, I found more pieces of the puzzle. The clerk, Jimmy Ramirez, remembered Thomas well. He'd come in for cigarettes, sometimes beer. Was trying to get clean, he said. Looked rough but always polite. Jimmy hesitated. "Last time I saw him was actually the night of the murder, around 8:30. He seemed upset, hands shaking when he paid." "Did you tell the police?" "Sure did. Detective wrote it down, said they'd be in touch. Never heard another word." This was a significant. Lee D. Thomas Ward, deliberately excluded from the investigation, had been in Millfield the very night of his sister's murder. But why would police ignore such an obvious person of interest? I needed to understand the relationship between Julia and Thomas. Court records showed Thomas had struggled with substance abuse and had several stints in rehab. Julia had posted bail for him twice and had been listed as his emergency contact on medical forms. But their relationship seemed to have soured in the months before Julia's death. A church secretary remembered Thomas attending services with Julia, and Daniel for a few months, then suddenly stopping. "There was some kind of confrontation," she recalled. "Thomas and one of our elders, Eric Stevens, they had words after a service. Julia was mortified. Thomas never came back after that." Eric Stevens. E.S. from Julia's journal, the connection sent. A chill through me. I needed to find Thomas, but he had vanished without a trace, until, unexpectedly, he found me. Returning to my hotel that evening, I found a note slipped under my door. Scrawled in hasty handwriting were the words, "Leave it alone. You don't know what you're stirring up. Some doors should stay closed." It wasn't signed, but hotel security footage showed a man matching Thomas Ward's description in the hallway outside my room. He had his face turned away from the cameras, deliberately avoiding identification. "He's scared," Marcus said when I called him. "But of what?" "Not..." "What?" I replied, thinking of Julia's journal. Who? That night, I received a text from an unknown number. Midnight Room. Storage facility on Route 16, Unit 224. Come alone tomorrow, 2 p.m. I had no way of knowing if the message was truly from Thomas Ward or if I was being lured into a trap. But one thing was certain. Someone was afraid of what my investigation might uncover. And when people are afraid, they either run or they fight back. The next day would reveal which option Thomas Ward had chosen. I didn't tell Marcus where I was going. If this was a trap, I didn't want to risk anyone else. The storage facility on Route 16 was a collection of identical metal units baking in the afternoon sun. Unit 224 had a padlock on it, but it hung open, waiting for me. Sliding the door up revealed a small space crammed with cardboard boxes, furniture, and plastic bins, the remnants of Thomas Ward's life. No sign of Thomas himself. Among the boxes was a single folding chair with an envelope taped to it. Inside the envelope was a key with a sticky note. Ward House, attic crawl space. I can't go back there. Thomas had set me up on a scavenger hunt, not a meeting. But why? I drove to the EIA. Ward House now sitting empty behind police tape. Using the press credentials that had gotten me into far more secure locations, I convinced the patrol officer to let me in for follow-up research on the documentary. The house felt frozen in time. In the kitchen, a coffee mug still sat in the sink. Upstairs, Julia's bedroom remained as it had been after the crime scene cleaners finished. Bed stripped, carpet removed, but otherwise intact. Daniel's room was the typical space of a 12-year-old boy. Books, a few model airplanes, a desk with school assignments neatly stacked. The attic access was in the hallway ceiling. I pulled down the ladder and climbed up, flashlight in hand. The crawl space was stifling, thick with heat and dust. In the far corner, I found what Thomas wanted me to see, a loose floorboard concealing a small recess. Inside was a stack of journals, at least a dozen, bound in identical black leather covers. I brought them down to the kitchen where the light was better. Each was labeled with a year, going back 7 years. These weren't Julia's prayer journals. They were her personal diaries. The early entries portrayed a woman struggling with a failed marriage and the challenges of raising a sensitive child alone. She wrote lovingly of Daniel's intelligence and creativity, though she worried about his social awkwardness. Thomas appeared frequently, her troubled brother who needed help getting back on his feet. But around 3 years back, the tone shifted. Julia's entries became increasingly focused on religion, specifically her growing involvement with a spiritual renewal group at her church, led by Elder Eric Stevens. Her writing took on a fervent, almost obsessive quality. Eric says Daniel's quietness is not shyness but defiance, she wrote. He says, I've been too permissive, that the boy needs stronger guidance to avoid the pitfalls that claimed Thomas's soul. Later entries described implementing disciplinary measures recommended by Eric. The midnight room works, she wrote. After 3 hours in darkness, Daniel was more compliant. Eric says consistency is key. My blood ran cold as I read entry after entry, detailing a system of control disguised as spiritual guidance. Julia described locking Daniel in a closet, the midnight room, for hours whenever he showed signs of corruption. She mentioned fasting punishments, prayer vigils, that lasted until dawn, and isolation from worldly influences like friends and extracurricular activities. Eric says Thomas is a bad influence on Daniel. One entry read, He undermines my authority with his secular thinking. I've prayed for guidance, and the answer is clear. Thomas must go if Daniel is to be saved. The most recent journal contained the most disturbing content. Julia described Eric's increasing control over her decisions regarding Daniel. Eric says the boy is showing signs of the same weakness that destroyed Thomas. More drastic measures are needed. The final entry, dated the day of her murder, contained a chilling passage. Eric is coming tonight to help with Daniel's final cleansing. The midnight room has been prepared. This time, the door will remain closed until the impurity is gone, no matter how long it takes. God will give us strength to do what must be done. I closed the journal, hands trembling. These weren't the writings of a loving mother, but of someone gradually pulled into a dangerous form of religious extremism. And Eric Stevens, the mysterious E.S., appeared to be at the center of it all. As I gathered the journals to take with me, I heard a noise from downstairs, the front door opening. Someone else had entered the house. Footsteps moved deliberately through the living room, heading toward the kitchen where I sat surrounded by Julia Ward's darkest secrets. I shoved the journals into my bag and stood up just as William Hayes, the prosecutor who had put Daniel behind bars, appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Ms. Reese," he said, his voice professionally pleasant despite the surprise in his eyes. "I wasn't aware anyone had authorization to be in here." "I could say the same for you, Mr. Hayes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "The trial's over. What brings the lead prosecutor back to the scene?" Hayes glanced at my bag, then around the kitchen, assessing what I might have found. "Loose ends. Even closed cases need proper documentation." He smiled thinly. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" "Research for my documentary. The officer outside gave me permission." "A documentary?" Hayes leaned against the door frame, blocking the exit. "You know, your reputation precedes you, Ms. Reese. 3 wrongful conviction cases overturned through your investigative journalism. Quite the crusader." "I just follow the evidence," I said. "Speaking of which, I'm curious why Thomas Ward wasn't mentioned in any of your case files." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps concern, crossed Hayes's face before his professional mask returned. Thomas Ward was determined to be irrelevant to the case. He hadn't lived here for weeks before the murder. That's not what witnesses say. Several people saw him in Millfield the day Julia died. Hayes straightened. "Hearsay from unreliable sources doesn't constitute evidence, as you well know." "What about the missing 17 minutes in the security footage? Or the blood spatter analysis that doesn't match Daniel's height? Or Julia's journals detailing her religious extremism and abuse?" With each question, I took a step forward. "You're chasing ghosts, Ms. Reese." Hayes's tone hardened. "We had a solid case. Physical evidence, a confession, motive. The jury agreed unanimously. After a 3-day trial with a defense attorney who barely cross-examined your witnesses. Alan Richards is a respected public defender. Who called you 17 times during pre-trial preparations?" I countered. "I have the phone records, Mr. Hayes." For the first time, Hayes looked genuinely unsettled. "Routine procedural discussions. On calls averaging 27 minutes? That's quite the procedural discussion." Hayes moved closer, lowering his voice. "Let me give you some friendly advice. This case is closed. Daniel Ward confessed. Justice was served. Digging into this will only damage your reputation and hurt people who've already suffered enough." "People like Eric Stevens?" I watched his reaction carefully. Hayes froze momentarily, then recovered. "I don't know who you're referring to." "I think you do. His name appears throughout Julia's personal journals, especially regarding something called the Midnight Room." "You're entering dangerous territory, Ms. Reese." All pretense of friendliness was gone. "Some stories are better left untold." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hayes?" "A professional courtesy. Millfield is a close-knit community. We protect our own." As he stepped aside to let me pass, Hayes added, "By the way, I'm meeting with the network executives funding your documentary next week. Standard protocol for cases involving minors. I'll be sure to express my concerns about your methods." I left the Ward house with Julia's journals and a growing certainty that the prosecution had deliberately buried evidence to secure a quick conviction. The question was why? What was William Hayes so desperate to hide? Back at my hotel, I called Marcus. "I need everything you can find on Eric Stevens, church elder, close to Julia. Ward, possible involvement with something called the Midnight Room." "Already on it," Marcus replied. "And Helen? Someone broke into our production office last night. Nothing taken, but your files were definitely searched." The implication was clear. I wasn't just uncovering a miscarriage of justice. I was threatening a carefully constructed narrative that powerful people needed to maintain, and they were now aware that I knew too much. With Julia's journals in my possession and Hayes's thinly veiled threat hanging over me, one thing became crystal clear. The story of Daniel Ward wasn't just about a murder. It was about a conspiracy of silence that had allowed a 12-year-old boy to take the fall for something far more sinister. Daniel's former fourth-grade teacher, Meredith Collins, lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of Millfield. Unlike many in town, she agreed to meet me without hesitation. "I've been waiting for someone to ask the right questions," she said, inviting me inside. Her living room was filled with colorful artwork, clearly the creations of her students over the years. No one listened to me during the trial. Meredith had taught at Millfield Elementary for 15 years. Daniel had been in her class the year before the murder. "He was brilliant," she said, pulling out a folder of preserved assignments. His essays were at high school level, his math skills even further advanced, but so withdrawn. He flinched at loud noises, avoided physical contact, classic signs of trauma. "Did you report your concerns?" She nodded grimly. 3 months before Julia's death, Daniel came to school with bruises on his arms. When I asked what happened, he just stared at the floor. The next day, he handed me this. She showed me a drawing. A small stick figure huddled in a dark space while 2 larger figures stood outside. One figure held what looked like a book, the other something long and thin. I filed a report with Child Protective Services immediately. Daniel eventually told me, "She locks me away when I'm unclean. The door closes at midnight." Meredith's voice cracked. "I knew something was terribly wrong in that house." "What happened with the CPS report?" "A caseworker visited the ward home once, Diane Keller. She and Julia attended the same church. The case was closed as unfounded after a single visit." Meredith's expression hardened. 2 weeks later, Julia transferred Daniel to another class. "Did you testify about this at the trial?" I tried. The defense barely questioned me. When I mentioned the midnight room, the prosecutor objected, claiming it was irrelevant to the murder charge. The judge agreed and instructed the jury to disregard my testimony. She shook her head. The whole trial felt choreographed. Meredith hesitated, then added, "There's something else. A few months before the incident, we had career day at school. Different community members came to talk about their jobs. Eric A. Stevens was one of them." "The church elder?" "Yes, he spoke about working in youth ministry. I remember because Daniel had such a strong reaction to him. He hid under his desk and refused to come out. When I tried to coax him, he was trembling. Stevens noticed and said something like, 'The boy needs stronger guidance than he's getting.' It felt inappropriate." "Did you include this in your report?" "Of course, but like everything else, it was ignored." After leaving Meredith's apartment, I drove to the County Child Protective Services office. Through a former contact, I gained access to the case files, heavily redacted but still revealing. Diane Keller's report was a single page, concluding that the ward home was well maintained, and Daniel appeared adequately cared for. No mention of the bruises, the drawing, or Daniel's concerning statement about being locked away. Most troubling was a note attached to the file. "Case reviewed and closed by request of Judge Reynolds," the same judge who later presided over Daniel's murder trial. This wasn't just a matter of a rushed investigation or an overworked system. There appeared to be active suppression of evidence that might have complicated the simple narrative of a disturbed boy killing his mother. I needed to speak with Daniel again, this time with the knowledge I'd gained. But when I arrived at Westridge Juvenile Detention Center the next morning, I was informed that my visitation privileges had been revoked by court. "Order." "Whose order?" I demanded. The administrator showed me the paperwork. "Judge Reynolds states that your visits are disruptive to the rehabilitation process." As I turned to leave, Officer Diaz, the guard who had supervised my previous visit, followed me to the parking lot. "Ms. Reese," he called, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "There's something you should know. After your last visit, Daniel started having nightmares, screaming about the midnight room and someone named Eric. He's never mentioned either before." My heart raced. "Officer Diaz, has Eric Stevens ever visited Daniel here?" Diaz's expression confirmed my suspicion before he spoke. 3 times, listed as a spiritual counselor from the community church. Their last meeting was right after your visit. Daniel hasn't spoken a word since." The pieces were aligning into a disturbing picture. "Daniel wasn't just a victim of a miscarriage of justice. He was still under the control of the very people who had orchestrated his conviction, and I was running out of time to uncover the truth before they silenced him, and possibly me, permanently. Getting back into Westridge Juvenile Detention Center required calling in every favor I had accumulated in 15 years of documentary filmmaking. Finally, through a judicial contact in the state capitol, I secured an emergency interview order, valid for 1 hour, on the grounds of gathering information for an appeal. Daniel had changed in the weeks since I'd last seen him. He seemed smaller, more withdrawn, his eyes constantly darting to the door as if expecting someone to interrupt us. The vibrant intelligence I'd glimpsed before had retreated behind a wall of fear. "Daniel," I began gently, "I've learned some things about your mother, about your home. I know about the Midnight Room." His eyes widened slightly, the first real reaction I'd seen. "It was the closet," he whispered, so softly I had to lean forward to hear him. "In the hallway. Big enough to sit in but not to lie down. She would lock me in there when I needed cleansing." "How long would she leave you there?" "Sometimes all night, sometimes longer." His fingers began their rhythmic tapping again. "She would read prayers through the door, said the darkness would drive out the evil in me." "When did this start?" "After she met Mr. Stevens at church. He told her I had signs." Daniel's voice became clinical, detached as if reciting something he'd heard many times. "Signs of corruption, weakness like my Uncle Thomas. She had to be strict or I would be lost." "Did Thomas know about the Midnight Room?" Daniel nodded. "He found out a few months before." "Before what happened?" "He was staying with us, and one night he heard me crying in the closet. He got really angry, broke the lock, took me out. They had a big fight. Mom said he was interfering with God's plan for me. He left after that." I took a deep breath. "Daniel, I need to ask you about the night your mother died. I've seen the evidence and there are inconsistencies. The blood patterns don't match someone your height. There's missing security footage. And I found your mother's journals." His face went completely still. "She wrote that Eric Stevens was coming that night for your final cleansing." "What did that mean, Daniel?" He stared at his hands for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, older, heavier with the weight of his secrets. "Mr. Stevens said I was beyond normal discipline, that I needed special treatment at a place he ran, a camp for troubled boys." Mom agreed. "They were going to take me that night." He swallowed hard. The Midnight Room was just the beginning. Kids who went to his camp didn't come back the same. "Daniel," I asked carefully, "did you kill your mother?" His eyes finally met mine, clear and direct for the first time. "No." He "To me, but I thought it would be safer in prison than staying there with him." "With Eric Stevens?" Daniel nodded once, then glanced anxiously at the camera in the corner. "He came to see me here. Said if I ever told anyone what really happened, he would make sure I never got out. That he had friends who could reach me anywhere. Why confess to something you didn't do?" "Because I saw what happened." His voice dropped to a whisper again. "I was hiding in the Midnight Room. Mom had put me there earlier, but she forgot to lock it. I saw everything through the crack in the door. When they left, I waited a while, then called 911. But I knew no one would believe me over him. He's important in Millfield. Everyone respects him. I'm just a weird kid nobody liked." A buzzer sounded, signaling the end of our time. Daniel tensed immediately. "Daniel, I believe you," I said quickly. "I'm going to help you, but I need to know, who killed your mother?" As the guard opened the door, Daniel leaned forward and whispered a name in my ear. Then he retreated back into his protective shell, eyes down, expression blank. The vulnerable truth-teller instantly replaced by the emotionless mask the world expected from the boy without a soul. I left Westridge with my heart racing. After weeks of investigation, I finally had what Daniel had been too terrified to give anyone else: the name of his mother's killer. Now I needed to find the evidence to prove it. But as I approached my car, realized I was being watched. A dark sedan with tinted windows idled at the far end of the parking lot. The same vehicle I'd spotted near my hotel the previous night. Someone was following me. And in a town where even the justice system seemed compromised, I couldn't be sure who to trust. I needed to, find Thomas Ward. If anyone could corroborate Daniel's story, it would be the man who had discovered the midnight room and confronted Julia about her treatment of her son. For 3 days, I followed the trail of breadcrumbs Thomas had left. The storage unit, a former employer in a neighboring town, a bartender who recognized his photo. Each lead brought me closer, but Thomas remained elusive, a man determined not to be found, until he found me. I returned to my motel room one evening to find him sitting in the darkness by the window, watching the parking lot with the vigilance of someone accustomed to being hunted. "You've been busy," he said without turning, "stirring up trouble in Millfield." Thomas Ward was a gaunt man in his late 30s, with the same blue eyes as Daniel, but none of his stillness. He vibrated with nervous energy, fingers drumming against his knee, gaze constantly shifting. "You left me Julia's journals," I said. "You wanted me to find them. I wanted someone to know the truth. Doesn't mean I wanted to be involved." He finally looked at me. "Did you talk to Daniel?" "Yes. He told me he didn't kill Julia." "Of course he didn't." Thomas's voice cracked. With emotion. "That boy couldn't kill a spider. Julia would make him catch them and release them outside, even in winter." "Then why confess?" Thomas ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Because he was terrified. Because he saw what happened. And because in Daniel's mind, prison was safer than the alternative. Eric Stevens's camp for troubled boys." Thomas's head snapped up. "He told you about that?" "Some. Not everything. That place is a nightmare. Religious brainwashing disguised as therapy. Kids go in normal and come out broken." Thomas stood abruptly. "I tried to warn Julia when I found Daniel locked in that closet, reciting Bible verses in the dark. I lost it. Told her she was becoming a monster. She said I was interfering with God's divine plan for Daniel." "You left him there," I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "I tried to get help." Thomas's eyes flashed. "Called CPS, but they brushed me off. Said they'd already investigated. Went to the police, but Stevens has friends there. Nobody would listen to an ex-addict with a record. So you came back the night of the murder." Thomas sank back into the chair. "I was going to take Daniel away. Had it all planned. A friend in another state who would help us disappear. But I was too late." "What happened that night, Thomas?" "I wasn't there for the actual murder. I stopped for gas about 20 minutes away. There's security footage proving it. By the time I arrived, there were already police cars outside. The house." His voice dropped. "But I know who did it. The same man who twisted my sister's mind with his religious fanaticism. The same man who wanted to send Daniel to that camp. Eric Stevens." Thomas nodded grimly. "Julia was finally having doubts about him. She'd found out something. I don't know what, but she called me that morning saying she'd been blind, that she needed to protect Daniel from Stevens, not the other way around. Why would Stevens kill her? Because Julia knew something that could destroy him, and because she was going to keep him from Daniel." Thomas leaned forward. "There's something you should know about Stevens. 3 years ago, a boy from his youth group accused him of inappropriate discipline, similar to what Julia did with the midnight room. The church covered it up, paid the family to stay quiet and leave town." As Thomas spoke, pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. Julia's growing religious extremism, the church's influence in the town, the rushed investigation focusing solely on Daniel, a conspiracy of silence to protect a respected community leader. "I need evidence, Thomas. Something that places Stevens at the house that night. I don't have any." He stood again, moving toward the door. "But I know someone who might. Robert Kendall, Stevens' friend. They were inseparable once. Robert drove him everywhere like some kind of devoted disciple. If Stevens went to Julia's house that night, Robert probably took him. Where can I find him? Last I heard, he was working at the lumber yard just outside town. But be careful." Thomas paused at the door. "Stevens has eyes everywhere in Millfield, and he won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens him, even a documentary filmmaker with connections." After Thomas left, I sat in the darkened room, processing everything I'd learned. The story had evolved beyond a wrongful conviction case. I was now investigating a powerful man protected by a network of community leaders, the police, The courts, the church, all complicit in sending a child to prison for a crime he didn't commit. If confirming my fears, my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Network execs called. Hayes got to them. They're pulling our funding unless we drop the Ward case immediately. The system was closing ranks against me, but I had come too far to stop now. A 12-year-old boy was serving life in prison while his mother's real killer walked free. Finding Robert Kendall was my next move, and perhaps my last chance to uncover the truth. The Millfield lumber yard sprawled across several acres at the edge of town, stacks of timber rising like wooden fortresses in the morning sun. Finding Robert Kendall proved surprisingly easy. He was the yard foreman, a stocky man with calloused hands and wary eyes. "Not here," he said tersely when I introduced myself. "Meet me at Dawson's Diner at lunch, 1 o'clock. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived. Kendall sat in a back booth, nervously, shredding a paper napkin. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in years. "I've been expecting someone to come asking questions eventually," he said, as I slid into the seat across from him. "Just surprised it took this long. You know why I'm here? The Ward case. The boy who went to prison for killing his mother." He glanced around the diner. "Except he didn't do it." My pulse quickened. "How do you know that?" "Because I was there that night." Kendall's voice dropped to a whisper. "Not in the house, in the car. I drove Eric there." I kept my expression neutral despite my racing heart. "Tell me everything, Mr. Kendall." Eric and Julia had been close for years. He was her spiritual advisor, practically ran her life toward the end. But something changed that last week. Julia called Eric, frantic about something she'd discovered. Said she couldn't let him near Daniel anymore. What had she discovered? Kendall shook his head. Eric didn't tell me specifics, just that Julia was making ridiculous accusations and needed to be brought back to reason. He asked me to drive him there that night. And you did. I thought he was just going to talk to her. Kendall's hands trembled slightly. I waited in the car. He was inside for maybe 20 minutes. When he came out, his shirt had blood on it. He said there had been an accident, that Julia had become hysterical and attacked him with a knife. He claimed self-defense. But you didn't go to the police. Eric said no one would. Believe us over Julia's reputation as the perfect church lady. That we'd both go to prison. Kendall's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know there was a child in the house. I swear to God I didn't know Daniel was there and saw everything. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't live with it anymore. Because my wife left me saying I've been a different man since that night. Because I've been seeing that boy's face in my dreams for months. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a plastic bag containing a crumpled piece of fabric. And because I kept this, the shirt Eric was wearing. I told him I'd destroy it, but I couldn't. The blood on it is Julia's. I stared at the evidence that could exonerate Daniel. Proof that Eric Stevens had been at the Ward house the night of the murder, his shirt stained with the victim's blood. Mr. Kendall, would you be willing to make an official statement? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed. The color drained from his face as he read the text message. He knows, Kendall whispered. Someone saw us talking. I have to go. He shoved the bag with the shirt across the table. Use this, but leave my name out of it if you can. He has friends everywhere. Kendall hurried out of the diner, leaving me with the physical evidence I needed to reopen Daniel's case. But I knew a blood-stained shirt alone wouldn't be enough, not against someone as protected as Eric Stevens. I needed to build an airtight case before approaching the authorities. Back at my hotel, I laid out everything I'd gathered. Julia's journals documenting the psychological abuse of her son, testimony from Daniel's teacher about her ignored CPS report, Thomas Ward's account of Julia's growing extremism under Stevens's influence, the inconsistencies in the physical evidence, Daniel's retraction of his confession, and now Robert Kendall's testimony and the blood-stained shirt. Individually, each piece could be dismissed or explained away. Together they told a compelling story of an innocent boy railroaded by a system determined to protect one of its own. I called Marcus. I'm ready to put it all together, but we need to move quickly. Things are getting dangerous here. Helen, Marcus's voice was urgent. Someone broke into your apartment back home last night. Your laptop is missing and they went through all your files. As if to punctuate his warning, I noticed a car parked across from my hotel room, the same dark sedan that had followed me from the detention center. Inside was a figure I recognized from photographs, Eric Stevens, watching my door with the patient focus of a predator. The game had changed. It was no longer just about exposing the truth. It was about staying alive long enough to do so. Armed with compelling evidence of Daniel's innocence, I approached the current Millfield District Attorney, Eleanor Patterson, a recent appointee who had no direct involvement in the original case. Her office was modern and impersonal, with law degrees prominently displayed but no family photos or personal touches. Patterson herself was a study in careful neutrality, professional, polite, but impossible to read. "This is certainly interesting material, Ms. Reese," she said after reviewing my evidence. The blood-stained shirt sat in its plastic bag on her desk, a silent accusation. "But I'm not sure it's sufficient to reopen the case." "Not sufficient?" I couldn't hide my disbelief. "I have physical evidence placing another suspect at the scene, testimony contradicting the official narrative, and documentation of investigative failures. What you have are allegations against a respected community leader, based largely on hearsay, a shirt with unverified bloodstains, and the word of a convicted murderer who previously confessed." Patterson's tone remained measured. "The Ward case was tried and resolved, according to proper procedure." Proper procedure? I felt my professional detachment slipping. The investigating officers ignored evidence that didn't fit their narrative. The prosecutor had inappropriate contact with the defense attorney. The judge dismissed crucial testimony. This wasn't justice. It was a choreographed conviction. Patterson steepled her fingers. "Those are serious accusations against the foundation of our legal system in Millfield." "Yes, they are, and they're supported by evidence." She sighed. "Look, I understand your passion for this case, but reopening it would require extraordinary circumstances and compelling new evidence that would likely change the outcome. I'm not convinced what you've presented meets that threshold." I recognized the bureaucratic stonewalling for what it was. Patterson had no intention of challenging the status quo, regardless of the evidence. Shifting tactics, I organized a public forum about Daniel's case at the local community college. The response was revealing. Half the seats filled with concerned citizens, the other half conspicuously empty. Those who did attend listened intently as I presented a sanitized version of my findings, careful to frame everything as questions rather than accusations. The local newspaper covered the forum with a dismissive article buried on page 6. Former prosecutor William Hayes issued a statement condemning me as an attention-seeking filmmaker exploiting tragedy for ratings. Even more troubling was the reaction from the television network funding my documentary. The executive producer called, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "Hayes contacted our legal department directly," he explained. "Made some very specific threats about defamation suits if we proceed with this project. The network is getting cold feet, Helen. We have evidence, John. Solid evidence that could free an innocent child. Evidence that implicates half the town's leadership in a cover-up. That's not a documentary anymore. That's a legal minefield." He paused. "Look, we're willing to continue. Funding if you redirect the focus. Make it a broader piece about juvenile justice. Use the Ward case as just one example without making specific accusations. You want me to bury the truth to avoid legal complications. I want you to be realistic about what battles can be won." His voice softened. "Some systems are too entrenched to be brought down by one documentary, Helen. I refuse the compromise." The next day, our funding was officially suspended. Without institutional support, I turned to social media, creating carefully worded posts about inconsistencies in the Ward case. They gained modest traction, enough to keep the story alive, but not enough to create the pressure needed for official action. When I attempted to file motions for case review through legal channels, procedural obstacles mounted. Forms were rejected for technical errors. Filing deadlines were mysteriously moved. Judge Reynolds, now retired in Florida, refused all comment through his attorney. A judicial clerk finally pulled me aside after yet another rejected filing. "It's not going to happen," she whispered. "Not through official channels. There's too much pressure from above to keep this case closed." "Why?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Eric Stevens' brother-in-law sits on the State Judicial Review Board. His cousin is a captain in the police department. His college roommate is the mayor." She glanced around nervously. "This isn't just about one man. It's about a network of influence. They're everywhere." The system that had rushed to judgment against Daniel Ward now refused to consider its mistake, not because the evidence was unconvincing, but because the implications were too damaging to the town's power structure. As public interest in my social media campaign grew, the pressure against me intensified. My motel refused to extend my stay. Local restaurants suddenly couldn't find my reservations. The dark sedan continued its silent surveillance, a constant reminder that I was unwelcome in Millfield. Then came the most disturbing development, a call from Officer Diaz at the Juvenile Detention Center. "Daniel's been transferred," he said without preamble. "Middle of the night, no warning. Some special youth rehabilitation program in another state." "What program? Where?" "That's just it. It's classified. Judge's orders, but I heard a name mentioned." When they were processing the paperwork, Diaz's voice dropped. "New Dawn Academy. Isn't that the place run by Eric Stevens?" I finished, cold dread washing over me. Despite being incarcerated, Daniel was being placed under the control of the very man he feared most, the man who had killed his mother and orchestrated his wrongful conviction. The system wasn't just silent. It was actively continuing the injustice, and time was running out for Daniel Ward. The road to New Dawn Academy wound through miles of dense forest, the facility itself hidden behind high fences topped with razor wire. Despite its remote location, I wasn't the first journalist to investigate the place. There had been scattered reports of controversial therapeutic techniques and allegations of abuse, all officially denied and eventually forgotten. With my press credentials effectively blacklisted in Millfield, I needed another way in. Marcus came through, arranging an interview under the pretense of a feature on innovative youth rehabilitation programs. 3 days after Daniel's transfer, I found myself sitting across from Eric Stevens in his immaculate office at New Dawn. He was not what I expected, not a fire and brimstone zealot, but a soft-spoken, articulate man with the polished charm of a skilled politician. Family photos decorated his desk. Inspirational quotes hung on the walls. Nothing in his demeanor suggested a man capable of murder. "We focus on structure and spiritual guidance," Stevens explained, leading me on a carefully choreographed tour. "Many of these young people come from chaotic backgrounds. They crave boundaries, even if they resist them initially." The facility resembled a cross between a military school and a church camp. Students, all boys between 12 and 17, moved in orderly lines, eyes downcast, responding to staff with rehearsed "yes sir" and "no sir" answers. "And your newest arrival?" I asked casually. "Daniel Ward?" Something flickered behind Stevens's pleasant expression. Surprise, perhaps concern. "Daniel is in our special intake program. Not available for interviews." Of course, I understand his case is quite unique. Every child here is unique, Ms. Reese. Stevens steered me toward the administration building. "Though I sense your interest in Daniel goes beyond professional curiosity. His story is compelling," I admitted. "A 12-year-old convicted of murdering his mother. Now I hear you were Julia Ward's spiritual advisor. A tragic situation?" Stevens shook his head sadly. "Julia was a devoted mother struggling with a deeply troubled child. I tried to help them both, by encouraging her to lock Daniel in a closet, by planning to bring him to this facility for special treatment." The mask slipped for just an instant, long enough to glimpse something cold and calculating beneath. Then the warm smile returned. "You've been misled, Ms. Reese. Julia practiced disciplinary methods of her own choosing. As for Daniel coming here, yes, we discussed it as an option for his behavioral issues, but nothing was decided. That's not what the evidence suggests. Julia's journals mention your encouragement of the Midnight Room. Daniel witnessed you in his house the night of the murder. And Robert Kendall. Drove you there. Stevens's smile vanished completely. I think this interview is over. As security guards appeared to escort me out, I played my final card. I have your shirt, Mr. Stevens, the one with Julia's blood on it. Kendall kept it, and he's not the only one who knows the truth. For a moment, genuine fear crossed Stevens's face. Then unexpectedly he laughed, a soft, confident sound. It doesn't matter what you think you know, he said quietly. No one will believe you over me. Not in this town. Not in this state. Daniel confessed. The case is closed. And now he's where he belongs, under proper guidance. Under your control, you mean, to ensure his silence. Stevens stepped closer. Let me be clear, Ms. Reese. You have no evidence that would stand up in court. You have no institutional support. Your reputation is already being questioned due to your obsessive behavior regarding this case. Walk away now while you still can. As the guards led me to my car, I glimpsed a small figure at an upstairs window, a boy watching with the stillness I'd come to recognize. Daniel. Our eyes met briefly before a staff member pulled him away from the glass. I left New Dawn Academy knowing I had failed. Despite all my evidence, all my efforts, the system had closed ranks to protect one of its own. Daniel remained imprisoned, now under the direct control of his mother's killer. The truth remained buried beneath layers of institutional protection and community. Denial. Back in my hotel, I made one last desperate attempt. I packaged all my evidence, the journals, the testimony, the blood-stained shirt, the analysis of investigation failures, and sent copies to the state attorney general, the FBI, and 3 national news organizations. I included a detailed account of the systemic corruption in Millfield and the suspicious circumstances of Daniel's transfer to New Dawn Academy. Then I began editing my documentary. Without network backing, without institutional support, it would be a guerrilla production released online. My testimony to the truth no one wanted to hear. 3 months later, The Boy Without a Soul, the true story of Daniel Ward, premiered on an independent streaming platform. It caused a brief stir in social media circles, prompted a few outraged editorials, and spawned several conspiracy theory threads. But there was no official response, no reopening of the case, no rescue for Daniel Ward. I visited him one last time after public interest had faded. New Dawn Academy had been forced to allow it due to persistent legal petitions. Daniel was 14 now, taller but still thin, his eyes carrying the weight of experiences no child should bear. They saw your film, he told me quietly. They made me watch it too. Said it was all lies. It's not, Daniel. Everything in it is true. I know. A small, sad smile touched his lips. But the truth doesn't always win, does it? Not immediately, but it doesn't go away either. I leaned forward. I'm not giving up, Daniel. This isn't over. He considered this, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a page torn from his mother's prayer journal. He had folded it into a small bird. The midnight room taught me something, he said, placing the paper bird on the table between us. Sometimes the only freedom you find is inside your own head. They can lock your body away, but they can't touch what you know is true. As I prepared to leave, Daniel spoke one last time. The door closes at midnight, he said, but even in the darkest room, morning eventually comes. I left New Dawn Academy with Daniel's paper bird and his quiet wisdom. The story of the boy without a soul had become something else entirely, a testament to the resilience of truth in the face of systemic corruption and the courage of a child who chose prison over becoming a victim again. In the end, the truth didn't set him free, but it made the cell feel less like a lie.